Today, I'm going to be talking about the federal government's involvement in higher education throughout history. The federal government, as we know it, did not officially come to be until 1787 after the Constitutional Convention. However, before this, revenues brought in by the colonies were used to support higher education. Thielen reports that higher education, relative to other public services at the time, received considerable government funding. Funds came from taxes and charges, such as bridge tolls, tobacco poundage, lottery proceeds, and surcharges on various licenses. The period between 1785 and 1860 was one generally of little government oversight throughout the United States. This was true in regard to higher education as well. Overall, there was a widespread distrust of the national government, and despite this, colleges thrived, but most of the decision-making power, including the chartering of new institutions, resided with state governments. One contribution during this time from the federal government were the U.S. military and naval academies, which were both developed by acts of Congress, both of which are still active today. During this time, the federal government was involved in research and scholarship in a limited capacity. One example was the development of the Smithsonian Institute in 1846, which has become the world's largest museum, education, and research complex. It was developed thanks to a donation by the nephew of James Smithsonian to develop, quote, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. Distrust of the federal government persisted into the latter part of the 19th century, especially among southern states. Two domains involving government that heavily impacted higher education during this time are the Civil War and the Morrill Act of 1862. The Civil War, which began in 1861, changed higher education. Antebellum changes occurring in the North were accelerated across the nation. For example, federal legislation led to state A&M colleges with an emphasis on science and engineering, rather than classic topics. This attracted middle and lower class men, which was different from the typical college student of the time. Additionally, decreased enrollment due to enlistment and the death of many servicemen students led institutions to expand recruitment efforts and increase access. Finally, the war provided opportunities for the government to push through previously stalled legislation, such as the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act of 1862 is often cited as the beginning of the federal government's support for higher education, as well as a model of federal and state cooperation in domestic programs. This was not the first time that land grants had been used, however, by the federal government. These were different in that rather than giving an institution land on which to build a campus, the government provided plots of land in the West for the institutions to sell to fund the development of state colleges with programs that would meet the needs of the community at the time. Despite this, the importance and overall impact of the Morrill Act on higher education is often over-exaggerated. Many states already had active and successful state colleges, and there was still little federal oversight. The requirements of the grant program were vague and not well regulated. Stagnation among land-grant colleges by 1880 led presidents from several such institutions to lobby in Washington. This led to two important pieces of legislation: the Hatch Act of 1887, which resulted in federal funding for agricultural research, and the Morrill Act of 1890, which replenished federal land funding for grant programs, resulting in increased eligibility for Black colleges and support for increased access for women by including teaching and home economic programs. Importantly, this brought three departments of the federal government, the Departments of Agriculture, Interior, and War, into a closer working relationship with higher education. Thielen states that, quote, the almost total lack of federal involvement in colleges and universities, with the important exception of the Morrill Act and related land grant legislation, left a mixed legacy. He explains that on one hand, a lack of federal oversight likely deprived institutions of potential government funding and regulation. On the other hand, institutions and their donors were happy to not be subjected to the government intrusions. This likely resulted in increased innovation and autonomy. The federal government's involvement during this time primarily related to World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918. Presidents of higher education institutions were generally supportive of the war effort. However, they were concerned that the enlistment and draft would decrease enrollment. This is exactly what happened. For example, Harvard and Yale saw around 40% drops in enrollment in a single year. In response to this, President Woodrow Wilson created the Student Army Training Corps in 1917 as a mutually beneficial solution. This funded on-campus training programs for cadets and officers. So campuses got paying bodies, and the government got well-trained, physically and mentally healthy men for combat. On the heels of World War I, the time between 1920 and 1945 was one of great research productivity for higher education. This was key in the war efforts, including research into the atom bomb and hydrogen bomb. This type of research paved the way for future partnerships between the federal government and higher education for large ventures such as research grants and the development of things like the National Institutes of Health. The time between 1945 and 1970 was a busy one in regard to higher education and the federal government. Strong federal support for research at higher education institutions continued. Additionally, due to drops in enrollment as a result of the draft, higher education became an area of focus among the public as well as the state and federal governments. In response to this, the GI Bill was introduced, and various reports on the state of higher education were conducted and released. In 1940, two goals emerged after the end of the war. First, economies needed to transition from wartime to peacetime productions in terms of industry, and second, they needed to develop programs to assist military veterans who came home without jobs or promising prospects. In 1944, Congress developed a bill called the 5220 Club, which provided each veteran $20 a week in unemployment. Public Law 346, also known as the Servicemen Readjustment Act, focused on keeping returning veterans occupied while factories could transition from wartime efforts, for example, transitioning from making tank tires to car tires. A late addition to the bill included the provision of an educational benefit, the GI Bill. This guaranteed veterans who had served at least 90 days, 1 year of education, plus 1 month for each month of active duty, up to a maximum of 48 months. The GI Bill was not expected to be widely utilized. However, by the fall of 1945, only 1 year after its inception, 88,000 veterans were taking advantage of these funds. Over 1 million were enrolled by 1946. In order to be eligible to receive GI funds, institutions had to be federally approved. This was done to protect veterans and taxpayer monies from diploma mills. A number of long-standing changes emerged as a result of the GI Bill. First was the accreditation process. The federal government did not want to be in the business of accrediting institutions. Additionally, institutions did not want to be inspected by the government. So regional accreditation bodies developed, and a 10-year regional accreditation process became the norm. Excuse me. Additionally, more applicants and the need for speedy decisions led to novel admission practices, including increased reliance on standardized testing and the acceptance of alternatives to typical transcripts. Excuse me. New fields of study were introduced based on the needs of the community, and finally, Black veterans who were also eligible for the GI Bill. This did increase the number of Black students in higher education. However, sadly, there were no requirements for participating institutions to be non-discriminatory in their admission practices. In 1956, President Harry Truman established the Commission on Higher Education to examine the functions of higher education in a democracy by the means by which they can best be performed. Specifically, he wanted to focus on identifying ways to expand educational opportunities to more people, develop new degree programs, and examine the financial structure for higher education as a response to the need for rapid expansion of facilities due to the increase in students. This commission was significant as it, quote, marked the first time a president of the United States deliberately extended federal inquiry into the nationwide educational issues. Truman believed that a strong higher education system was in the best interest of the nation. Vannevar Bush was the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II. In 1945, he published Science: The Endless Frontier, which focused on the importance of federal support for advanced research. He felt that the, quote, pioneer spirit that had once characterized the New World could be recaptured by scientific inquiry. He recommended the creation of a permanent and well-funded federal agency for supporting research in higher education, and ultimately this was the prototype for the National Science Foundation. He also supported competitive grant programs to allow university researchers to compete for government projects. This was novel as the government typically housed its own research lab and projects. This report had a more significant and lasting effect than the Truman's Commission report. These new collaborations were not without controversy, as many institutions did not want the federal intrusions. However, these institutions quickly learned that they must accept federal monies to stay competitive, meaning that external federal agencies now had the power to alter campus governance and the internal mission, including the essential tenets of academic freedom, which is huge. The period between 1970 and 2000 was one of flux in higher education. Institutions were presented with a rapid growth and no real roadmap to follow. The support of the federal government between this time shifted from research to undergraduate needs-based financial aid. Institutions continued to have conflicting feelings about accepting federal monies and the federal intrusions that came with that. Federal financial aid was an appealing alternative. As an amendment to the Higher Education Act, the Basic Education Opportunities Grants, later known as Pell Grants, were developed. These were entitlement-based, meaning that anyone who met the criteria was eligible to receive the money. They were also portable, meaning that the money went with the student. This led to competition amongst higher education institutions to attract students and their Pell Grant monies. Interestingly, institutions who accepted this money were still subject to federal oversight. In 1978, focus shifted from Pell Grants to student loans. This was a popular initiative. However, more students were stuck with huge amounts of debt upon graduation. As part of the 1972 amendments to the Higher Education Act of '64, incentives were provided to states for the creation of state higher education coordination agencies. These agencies would serve as a liaison between the government and the institution. In the 1980s, gubernatorial candidates campaigned as higher education governors. They wanted to support partnerships between the government, private industry, and higher education as a way to create a strong, high-tech state economy. Phelan stated that during this time, quote, government regulations had become unreasonable and excessive. However, institutions had no choice to comply as they relied on federal grants and subsidies. This brings us into the 21st century. During this time, student financial aid programs were the subject of much controversy due to the concerns about significant debt for graduates. Federal support for research declined as more and more institutions competed for a limited number of grants. And finally, more institutions sought federal aid as state subsidies declined and the institutions battled with decisions regarding tuition increases. Rising college costs meant that politicians relied on federally backed student loan programs. However, in 2014, the media began discussing the student debt crisis. Students were unhappy with the repayment programs, and the loan forgiveness programs for public service employees were not working well. Requirements for institutions that received federal funds, examples include FERPA, Higher Education Opportunity Act, Copyright Act, ADA, FMLA, Age Discrimination Act, and Title IX. I wanted to provide a current day and highly relevant example of the government's impact on higher education. Very recently, President Biden mandated that all employers with 100 or more employees would have to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine or conduct weekly testing. This applies to private and public colleges. Employers are not required to pay for weekly testing or face coverings for non-vaccinated employees, meaning that the employees themselves would have to cover these costs. Additionally, healthcare facilities that participate in Medicaid or Medicare also must follow this mandate. This would impact students that may be placed in clinical sites. The impacts of this are yet to be seen. However, it is likely that institutions will lose employees because of the mandate. However, institutions cannot afford to not comply, as this would result in a significant loss of funding. In summary, the federal government has been involved in higher education in varying capacities since the beginning of higher education. There are pros and cons to these arrangements for all parties involved. The primary ways of involvement include research, funding, and mandates for institutions receiving federal money. The complicated relationship continues as institutions receive less federal and state monies, and the cost of providing an education continues to increase. The federal government, state governments, and higher education institutions will have to work together to ensure the future success and stability for higher education in the United States. And here are my references. Thank you for viewing my presentation.